There we go. So, oh yeah, if you'd like to turn the lights off over there. Thank you. So today's program is all about Florida rain gardens, and one of our master gardeners, Lindsay Picard, she's here. She spoke last week all about Zoe's gardens, and then this week she's going to come in and she's going to be talking, or last month, not last week, last month she talked about Zoe's gardens, and today she's going to be talking about rain gardens and how rain gardens can be used in Florida and some of the important roles, especially related to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. So I want to thank Lindsay for joining us today, and I'd like to invite her up.
All right. Hi, everyone. Still so odd to wear these when I have an audience, but okay. No, I don't want to scream. All right. Welcome, everyone. Is that better? Great. Okay, so I came here to talk to you about Florida rain gardens. My first experience with rain gardens was actually in New Hampshire. I had a drainage swale going through my front yard. It ran through the front and then down the side of a big hill into a freshwater stream. I noticed that the previous owners had brought in a lot of fill to stop the erosion. So I didn't know much about rain gardens, and I decided, why not just throw a couple bags of wildflower seed mix and see what happens? Not much happened, but I did stop mowing, and I had a lot of wild carrot that came up. I thought that was great. It looked very lovely. The bunnies seemed to enjoy the tops of the carrots. Then I realized it's invasive later on. So don't do what I did. I'm here to talk to you about how to create successful gardens, ones that don't support invasives, but do support wildlife. And also, I learned a lot because those gardens actually stop the erosion coming down the side of the hill. When I let those grasses grow long, different types of wild grasses came in, and it sequestered a lot of rainwater. All right, so before we get started on how talking about building rain gardens that will be successful, we're going to cover some objectives today, and that's going to be the Florida Friendly 9 principles. We're going to talk about stormwater runoff, the impact to our Florida water resources, and some best management practices on how to handle water in your home. Along with that, we're going to be talking about building a rain garden, the best placement, how big it should be, how to build it, different types of plant choices, maintenance, and then we're going to talk about some plants that I'm going to suggest that will do really well in these gardens. All right. Start off planning our gardens. It's important that we consider Florida friendly landscaping because rain gardens are such a huge component of Florida friendly. While we always aim to implement every principle in our gardens, numbers 1, right plant, right place. Number 2, water efficiently. Number 4, mulch. 5, attract wildlife. 8, reducing stormwater runoff. And 9, protect the waterfront are effortlessly covered when we implement rain gardens. Okay, so it's no secret that Florida has some of the most unique water sources in the world, from our gorgeous freshwater springs, beautiful beaches, and biodiverse wetlands like the Everglades. Each water feature is actually fed from rainwater or our aquifers. Florida is built on mostly limestone, which creates one of the most abundant aquifers on the planet, and it's known as our Floridian aquifer. In general, aquifers are porous rock that allows water to move through our state. They're directly replenished by our rainwater, which percolates through the ground. The Floridian aquifer actually supplies 2.5 billion gallons of water per day. And that's for our drinking water, that's for irrigation, manufacturing, and so on. However, the amount of water drawn from the aquifers creates significant stress on our water resources. As our population grows, so does the demand for water. Moreover, as our population grows, we're losing a lot of natural green spaces that once captured this rainwater. And as they're replaced with impervious surfaces like rooftops and concrete and asphalt, we're seeing greater amounts of stormwater runoff. This is not replenishing our aquifers as it once did. And unfortunately, Stormwater runoff can lead to a lot of saltwater intrusion in sinkholes as more and more water is being depleted from the aquifers. Saltwater intrusion is seen a lot more. Okay, so stormwater and pollution. Again, like I just mentioned, as we lose these green spaces, we see a significant increase in stormwater runoff, which creates us a big problem of flooding, stress on our stormwater infrastructure, and pollution. As rainwater and irrigation travels over hard surfaces and lawns, it picks up whatever's on the ground or on our rooftops, including chemicals, fertilizers, trash, pet waste, oil, or any other toxic chemicals. This is known as non-point source pollution, which unfortunately is the leading source of pollution in Florida and throughout our entire country. Non-point source pollution is known to cause our red tide issues in our oceans, which kill our fish, wildlife, vegetation, fouls our drinking water, and makes recreational areas unsafe. So to protect our precious water resources from stormwater pollution, we can prevent runoff in our own landscapes. And this is the primary objective for Florida-friendly landscape, and that's to protect our waterfront. So how do we do it? There's a couple of cultural practices that we can implement to conserve and protect water by reducing stormwater runoff and non-point source pollution. Those are choosing Florida-friendly or native plants that are already acclimated to our climate and don't need excess irrigation once they're established. Instead of high maintenance areas of lawn that we use for play or our pets, you can incorporate a mixture of drought-tolerant ground covers to sequester more water than just traditional lawns. Or in low traffic areas that aren't really utilized in your yard, you can replace it with ground covers, which also have typically a longer root system and is able to trap more rainwater. As always, apply a 2 to 3 inch of mulch in your plant beds. It reduces the amount of soil erosion, retains moisture, which reduces the need for irrigation draining our aquifers. Also minimizes the amount of weeds you have and need for herbicides. Fertilize only as needed and use a slow release fertilizer with equal parts of nitrogen and potassium, but little to no phosphorus. Florida-friendly best management practices ask that you only water as needed. Essentially, you can turn your irrigation off unless there's a long period of drought. Just check for signs of distress on your plants, such as wilting or browning or curling of the leaves. Once native and Florida-friendly plants, again, are established, they only require irrigation about every 10 to 14 days if there's no rain, and only 3/4 of an inch to an inch of water per irrigation event. And so be sure when you are using your irrigation, you do it early in the morning to prevent any water loss from wind or evaporation. And it's best to replace sprinklers to low volume irrigation like drip lines in plant beds to minimize overspray and excess watering. I always like to recommend too that you go around, check your sprinklers and see if they're spraying onto any hard surfaces and if you can't redirect them. This will help with rainwater runoff. Check on your rain shutoff devices that are on your irrigation system because often the humidity in our climate can affect how they're working. So check to make sure that they're doing their job, or you can just use a rain gauge. You can install rain barrels or cisterns to capture stormwater runoff that reduces your watering bill. It's free, clean water for your plants, reduces the erosion around your house. And you can also create a dry well or direct rainwater into plant beds. But most importantly, what we all came here to talk about today is we can make rain gardens. All right, rain gardens actually protect our water resources. Its objective is to retain, filter, and treat storm water runoff, but most importantly, recharge our groundwater supply. When we typically think of a rain garden, we think of a shallow depression with some mulch and vegetation that's tolerant of short-term flooding. But here in Florida, it's a little bit different because our rain gardens must be able to handle periods of inundation and periods of drought. Our climate is characterized by a rainy and dry season. Our rainy season begins June 1st and ends in October. According to the FSU Climate Center, we can see about 40 to 60 inches a year in rainfall, which mostly occurs in our rainy season. During the wet season, we can see up to 8 inches of rainfall in just 1 month. But on the other hand, it's only 2 to 3 inches, and someone mentioned earlier, we're about 3 inches behind in a drought right now. But I want you to imagine 1 inch of rainfall per 1,000 square foot of roof space can produce up to 600 gallons of water. Now, to imagine that a rain garden has the potential to capture and store and filter that much water, it's truly amazing. But I want you to separate rain gardens from bioretention areas, because unlike bioretention areas, we design rain gardens to allow stormwater runoff to percolate through the ground. It doesn't stand there. It strains out impurities before they actually drain into our waterways or our aquifers. So when we're designing the rain gardens for our climate, they'll end up providing a lot of different functions, such as providing habitat for birds and butterflies and other different beneficial insects. Again, that's a Florida-friendly principle. Improves your property value with curb appeal, reduces stress on our stormwater infrastructure, reduces irrigation needs and your water bill. An established rain garden, like I said before, doesn't typically need excess irrigation. Reduce your maintenance inputs. You don't need to mow as much or fertilize as much. And one of the biggest influences is that it'll reduce urban flooding. It's pretty amazing to think that plant roots improve water quality. They're actually able to filter 40% of all metal pollutants from roof shingles, vehicle fluids, or even that are trapped in the soil. They're said to capture 15% of all nitrogen from fertilizers or pet waste or organic matter that's decomposing, like grass clippings or leaves. So overall, when compared to bare areas of exposed soil, rain gardens have the capability to reduce runoff by up to 30%. All in all, the more rain gardens that are constructed in our communities and our neighborhoods, the more significant benefit we have. Did that change slides? Yes, it did. All right. So there's 3 major components of a rain garden that we have to get right in order for our gardens to succeed. It's going to be your plants, your soil, and your cover. Again, the plants need to withstand periods of drought and inundation, support wildlife, and we really want to aim for visual interest all year long. The soil in a rain garden should be loose, and it's going to allow these roots to reach down, and it will support a heavy root matrix. Ideally, the soil that you'll have in your rain garden will be about 50% sand, 30% topsoil, maybe 20% compost. Mulching in a rain garden is essential. You can also use rock or gravel to create a dry creek going from your water source to your garden, or use larger rocks around the perimeter of your rain garden to help reinforce the rain garden during large storms. But I really want to mention that the University of Florida and the University of Washington has created excellent guides that will walk you through how to build your rain gardens, and they're found here. Okay. So when we're starting to think about building these, we want to find our water source. You take a look around your property, determine where you'd like your rain garden, and then check to see where the water source is going to be coming from. Are you going to capture it off sidewalks or from your gutters or off a slope? There's many ways to direct water into your garden. You can create things like French drains, dry wells, dry creeks, or swales. Typically, the most water will be coming from your roof or your downspout, and that's usually where rain gardens get their water. But remember, the purpose of a rain garden is to capture stormwater. So make sure you're able to direct stormwater to where you want it to go, wherever you decide to direct it from. All right, so where do we put it? How big do we build it? Once you've identified where your water source is, you'll need to decide where the water or where the rain garden will go. It should be at least 10 feet from any house or any building so water doesn't seep into the foundation. Never place the rain garden over a septic or drain fields or directly under a large tree. We don't want to dig down and disrupt roots, weakening a tree. If you already have a low spot in your yard, it might be your first obvious choice to pick that spot, but I will caution you, it might not be the best spot. If water is already standing, it could be due to really heavy clay soils, and it would be extremely expensive and hard work to go ahead and amend the entire area that will allow filtration. But we'll discuss the type of soil that you need for your rain gardens further on. A full sun area is best, but part shade's fine as well. Your garden can be any shape you want it to be to fit in with your landscape aesthetics, but crescent and kidney shapes are often very popular and effective. And when you're selecting location, I would just want you to pay special attention if it's 30 feet from your water source or further than 30 feet from your water source. This will impact the calculations we need to make later on to determine the flow of water that your garden will be able to handle. We're going to walk through how to determine the size of the garden. It is a little bit of calculations, like I just mentioned. They are required, but it's relatively straightforward. I don't recommend it, but if you do decide to skip the calculations, make sure to build an outflow. That does defeat the purpose of filtering the water, but I digress. To figure out what size is appropriate for you, for your landscape, we need to find your size factor. And this is in the equation that you see. The size factor is dictated by the soil type and your depth. So we need to find soil type and depth first to find size factor. Once we have that, we calculate the drainage area, which is simply the square footage of the area that the water's running off of, whether that be your roof or your lawn or a sidewalk. Then we multiply those two factors and it gives us the area. Okay. So talking about size factor, the typical rain garden is about 100 to 300 square feet. Under 100, it doesn't allow for enough diversity of plants. Over 300, do we have a question? Oh no. Okay. Sure, it sounds like we're having issues connecting online. So if there's any questions at the end, we'll make sure we email this PowerPoint out and we can take questions via email or anything like that. Okay, great. So what I was saying is usually the typical size of your rain garden is about 100 to 300 square feet. If it's less than 100, it's not enough. There's not enough space for biodiversity and developing that thick root matrix. Over 300 square feet, it's really costly and expensive. But the size factor is what we're trying to figure out. And that's based on your soil type and the depth, like I had mentioned. To determine the soil type and its drainage capabilities, it's recommended to do an infiltration test. This is done by picking a few different spots in your yard that you might want to have the rain garden. Dig down 6 to 12 inches, fill the hole with water, and watch how long it takes to drain. And it's recommended that you conduct this test at least twice in each hole. If it drains within 12 hours, it's a very quick draining garden. If it's 12 to 72 hours, that's your standard rain garden and that's the goal. If it's more than 3 days or 72 hours, then you're going to end up with a wetland mosquito pit and it's not suitable for having a rain garden. If it is slow draining, you can do another test to investigate the soil further. And that's just you take a handful of damp soil from the bottom of the hole. It's very important, it's from the bottom. Knead it between your fingers, roll it into a ball. If it starts to, when you're kneading it between your thumb and your forefinger and it starts to create a ribbon, then you mostly have clay. And again, if you have clay at 12 inches deep, then that is not a suitable place for a rain garden because you're not going to have water infiltrating the soil. Okay, so we have our soil. Now, how about depth? Typically, Florida has very sandy soils and most rain gardens are between 4 to 8 inches. Deeper than 8 inches, it might hold water for too long. Less than 4 inches, we might need to make the surface area larger to provide enough water storage. If your garden is on the side of a slope, you also need to do extra calculations to incorporate that into the inflow rate of your garden. But there's more information on the IFAS rain garden guide that I had mentioned earlier that I'll walk you through how to figure out how to incorporate slope. But the main goal is to keep the garden level, which is the most efficient way to collect and have water infiltrate without losing excess over the sides of the garden. So now we have the soil type. We can decide on the depth. If you take a look at the chart that's up here, you can choose your size factor without the depth, or you can, whatever you're willing to, how deep you're willing to dig, you can use the size factor on the chart listed. And again, this is right from the UF Rain Garden Guide. So if you don't have this, the guide will help you. But this is the first step into solving the equation. Again, size factor times drainage equals the recommended garden size. Okay, so now for the drainage area. The drainage area is the total area of the roof and the lawn that actually drains into the garden. So to do this calculation, you're going to need your home square footage. Estimate the percent of the roof that feeds your water source, because again, it's usually a downspout that feeds these rain gardens. So a good example would be, you have a house with 4 downspouts, that's roughly about 25% of the roof runoff. You multiply your square footage by the percent, and that is your drainage area. But again, remember when I had said earlier, I want you to know if your garden's 30 feet to a water source or further than 30 feet. And that's because if it's further than 30 feet, you need to incorporate the lawn space that's also running into the rain garden into your calculations. And to do this, you'll need to find the area of the lawn draining into the garden. That's mostly just length times width. And then add that to your drainage area that we just previously calculated. And then you'll have your total area. Hope I didn't lose anybody. We can do a quick example. So I have a house that's 2,000 square feet and it has 5 downspouts. I have sandy soil and I'm prepared to only dig 5 inches. I'm lazy. And it's about 15 feet from my home. So what I would do is I would look at the chart. I have sandy soil. I only want to dig about 5 inches. So it looks like my size factor is 0.19. All right, and what else do I do? I need to calculate the drainage area. So my house is 2,000 square feet, times that by 20%, that equals 400. So what I'm going to do is take that 400, times it by the size factor of 0.19. That gives me 76 square feet. But if you remember, I'd mentioned under 100 square feet doesn't give you enough space to build that deep root matrix that you want for these gardens. So I'm just going to round it up to 100 and call it a day. But that's how you'd go about figuring out the size of your rain gardens. Okay, so now that we know how big it's going to be, we need to decide how we're going to build it. And just before we start off any gardening project, you need to call 811, and it's a free service that'll come out and mark all your underground utilities. Mark the shape of your garden. You can use an old hose or a rope or spray paint, whatever you'd like. Remove the vegetation, dig down to your desired depth. The center should be the deepest with sloping sides around the perimeter. You can create berms with the excavated soil. And if you plan to amend your soil, adding compost or adding more sand, then now is the time to do it. Make sure you dig a little bit deeper than originally planned, amend and replace the soil. All right, when we're choosing plants for our garden, this is the fun part, but our goal again is to create a thick matrix of roots, right plant, right place. Using different types of plants, this will create that strong root matrix that we're looking for, that's capable of sequestering all the stormwater runoff that, and you can see in this photo, the red arrow is pointing to Kentucky bluegrass. While we don't really have that here, there's a lot of plants that we do have, and it just gives you an idea of actually how deep and how successful our native plants are at digging deep down and sequestering water and filtrating nutrients compared to traditional lawn gardens. And when we're choosing plants, remember, we want drought tolerant plants because of our dry season and plants that can handle inundation. And we always want to choose Florida-friendly plants and aim for native. And when you're installing your rain garden, there's a couple of notes I want to mention. Try not to step on the area of the garden. It's inevitable when you're planting, but try not to walk in it. This will avoid compaction as much as possible. And don't forget, the main component a main component of your rain garden is adding mulch. Select hardwood mulches, but please stay away from cypress because of its sustainability. And then after planting, water your plants daily for about 2 days if there's, or 2 days, excuse me, 2 weeks if there's no rain that's already providing irrigation. And then don't forget to add your favorite ornamentals like stones, benches, a couple gnomes, bird feeder, whatever you'd like. All right, some expected maintenance in the first 2 years. There's going to be things that you're going to have to do, but after that, it'll be pretty much self-sustainable. You're going to have to weed a bit, remove any debris, but you're going to have to really take a good look and do regular visual inspections. We're going to be checking for erosion or excessive sediment deposits. And this is going to tell us if we need to make the rain garden larger or not. We're going to keep an eye out for bare spots of mulch. You're going to need to replace the mulch about every 2 to 3 years. Selective pruning can be done at the end of the growing season after danger of frost is passed. And you can cut back tall grass if desired. After a couple of years, division of tubers and bulbs, it might be necessary if they're taking over. But again, once they fill in, it's relatively self-sustainable. All right, so plant selection. Again, we're aiming for diversity here that supports wildlife. And we do that by picking the right plant for the right place that creates an interesting mix of plants that blooms at different times of year in different colors. My biggest mistakes that I'm just going to remind you, don't forget to plant according to plant size at maturity. It might look small now, but in a couple of years, it might take over. A couple things to note. It's a great time of year to start planning your rain garden. You can start shopping for all of the different types of plants and get an idea what they look like throughout their growing seasons now. But unless you're familiar with your home, I would recommend waiting until after the rain season actually begins to plant your gardens. Like if you've just moved here, what looks nice and dry now can be under 4 inches of water in a single storm event. So wait for June and watch how the water moves through your property. Once the actual rain season begins in June, you can see where the water is flowing, and it will be a perfect time to go ahead and make any adjustments to your final rain garden plan. Then at the end of the rainy season around November, it's a great time to start planting because it'll still be warm enough and allow the plants to have time to establish, yet it won't be so scorching hot that they will end up not surviving. And when planting and when choosing plants, you need to think of 3 different types of zones in your rain garden that you need to choose plants for. Again, right plant, right place. Zone 1, that's considered to have plants that enjoy having wet feet or with the highest water needs. And that's in the center of the rain garden. Zone 2 is this, sides and slopes. Use plants that don't mind moisture. And then on zone 3, these are your edges. This is technically going to be dry for the most part, and plants are going to prefer dry, but they need to be able to handle, again, periods of flooding. So everyone, this is the best part, right? We get to talk about the flowers. These are zone 1 wet feet loving plants. We have salvia, which is a perennial native, blooms late spring and fall, throughout the fall. Makes great cut flowers, border edging, or mass planting. It's a heavy reseeder though, it will spread. It prefers moist soil and can handle up to well-draining soil. It shines during the hottest summer months when everything else starts to fade because of the heat. And most of these plants that we're going to talk about today, they all attract butterflies and hummingbirds, so it's an excellent addition. Joe Pye weed, again, it's a perennial native. It's best in moist conditions, so it'll do excellent in the center of your garden. It'll even do well to slightly moist soils. It can get up to 10 feet tall. This plant is, but the interesting part is that this plant is relative to moisture. So the taller it gets because the wetter it is. It also attracts butterflies, skippers, beetles, wasps, all different kinds of pollinators. And we have rain lilies. This is a gorgeous flower that's either pink, white, or even yellow, but it usually blooms right after it rains. And it will bloom usually in the late winter through early summer. And then These next plants that I want to talk about, I do want to talk about them with an air of caution. They must be planted in the center because they need constantly wet soils. They may not even work in most rain gardens, especially if they're fast rating or it tends to dry out. They can be adapted to drier soils, but they're either aquatic or semi-aquatic. So they'll definitely need supplemental irrigation during dry spells. They may not, again, they're not suitable for all rain gardens, but I thought it was important to talk about some plants that can handle lots of water. We have swamp milkweed, which is a heat-loving native perennial, loves moisture, and it's a host plant to a couple different butterflies, including the monarch. Golden canna, which is our native large showy canna. It is aquatic, but I do have it growing in underneath pine, which is, it stays pretty wet. But the popular commercial ones, they can handle drier soils. So you can find cultivars that will work for your rain gardens. And they're interesting even when they're not in bloom. The blue flag iris, that's an immersed plant. It typically likes to be underwater, but they can grow in standing water and normal garden soils. We just have to make sure that they stay moist. So depending on how well your garden does at infiltrating, these might not be the best, or they might work. Cardinal flower is a native that's really loved by hummingbirds. It's used as a wildflower in moist gardens, on edgings of a water garden or understory plant in wet woods. The Louisiana iris that offers spring flowers and are often used for cut flower arrangements. There's hybrids that are clumping, spreading, but they're all perennials. Make a great background or specimen plant. All right, so zone 2. These plants like your occasional wet feet. And I want to again mention, I don't know if I had said it before, these are not inclusive lists. There's plenty of plants you can use. These are just to give you some ideas of what to look for. We have the gorgeous swamp sunflower. Florida is actually home to a lot of different types of sunflowers and native species of sunflowers, but this one's really interesting because it's great for mass plantings. As you can see, it creates that bushy type. It grows well in a variety of soils between well-draining sites, dry sites to wet sites. So you can use this throughout the garden and even soils with some clay. Tolerates heat and humidity when other plants don't. Attracts a variety of pollinators and actually makes a great shelter for different animals. We have the Carolina aster, which is a native woody viney shrub, usually found in Florida's riverbanks. Has fall blooms and it's 12 inches. It can get up to 12 inches tall and 2 to 4 feet, 2 to 4 feet wide. Tolerates a range of drought and wet conditions. Attracts both birds and pollinators. Goldenrod. People often associate goldenrod with fall allergies, but the truth is their pollen's a bit heavy to be carried and cause allergies. It's usually from ragweed, which also blooms around the same time, and it causes a lot of people to suffer from allergic reactions. So don't be nervous about using it in your gardens. However, goldenrod does tend to colonize and crowd other plants, so you can feel free to thin it out whenever you need to. And it's one of the top pollinator plants for birds, butterflies, and different types of beneficial insects. Then we have ironweed, which is, as the name suggests, it's a tough native plant. It's a long-lived perennial. It strongly competes, and it will become weedy if it's not maintained. It's a heavy self-reseeder, and it flourishes in moist areas. In July to October, masses of dark purple flowers appear at the top, and it creates, it's a great pollinator attractor and nectar source for different hummingbirds, bees, and butterflies. Then we have beggar's tick, and it's one of my favorites. It's a common weed people mostly consider in their lawns. If their lawns are being over irrigated, then you'll see it pop up a lot. But it actually has edible flowers, and its leaves are used to brew tea. It can colonize an area pretty quickly through seed though, but it's again a favorite amongst pollinators. All right, this is zone 3. These plants have affinity for drier soils, but don't mind occasional floods. Again, not an inclusive list. So we have tickseed, which is an annual to short-lived perennial, flowerings from late spring to fall. It only lasts about 3 to 4 seasons, but it does reseed, so it should stay in your property for a long time. You can use it as a border or edge. Removing the dead flower, deadheading, immediately actually prolongs its blooming. Purple coneflower. This is a shady, loving perennial. It flowers spring through summer. It might grow for a year out and then fizzle, or a year or two and then fizzle out. But if you divide it, if you dig it up and divide it every few years, it'll keep the plant blooming. A lot of people use these for cut flowers, edging, or planting. The roots have been used actually to treat a lot of different ailments, even rabies, snake bites, and different types of skin diseases. It again attracts butterflies. And then blazing star. This flowers in the fall. It makes great cut flowers, and it's best planted when you grow them in large masses. It can rot if the soil is too moist though. It does make a great edge plant. It's drought tolerant, loved by butterflies and bees. And then hibiscus. The image shown is our marsh hibiscus, which is one of our 35 species of native hibiscus, usually called rose mallows. Blooms mid to late summer, handles wetlands and drier soils. Ranges from an upright shrub to a tall tree, or excuse me, a small tree form. Some are compact and some are thin. You can use it as a hedge, a screen, a specimen plant, or background plant, but it will usually freeze back and then return in the spring. A favorite, again, amongst hummingbirds and butterflies. Okay, some ground covers. Here we have swamp twinflower. Again, it's a perennial. Spring through fall, lavender flowers. Tolerates dry to moist, so this can be used throughout the garden. It has compact growth, and it's easy to grow for small spaces. It's the host plant for the common buckeye butterfly. Fern, the cinnamon fern. All ferns prefer well-drained soil high in organic matter. Most ferns require a moist, shady spot. So if you do have a partial shade rain garden, this is an excellent addition. If it doesn't rain though, it will need about 1 inch of water per week of additional irrigation. Blue-eyed grass, again, a native perennial. It has grass-like clumps and star-shaped flowers on stalks that rise in the spring. It's a self-seeder and can be divided after the bloom season every 2 or 3 years. Frog fruit is a favorite. You can call it turkey tangle, capeweed, creeping Charlie. It's considered to be a weed since it invades lawns, especially those that are irrigated, but it makes the perfect ground cover. And it's an alternative to turf grass. It's tolerant of many different types of soil and moisture fluctuations. It needs minimal care once it's established, but it'll die out during long and extended periods of dry. Forms dense mats and attracts a variety of pollinators. And it's also a host plant for several different butterfly species. White top sedge is a great addition to your rain gardens. It actually has white brackets instead of flowers, and it resembles a star. Some people call it star rush. It's found in wet, open areas, flatwoods, depressions, and ditches. Star rush is a native sedge, and it's best for garden zones of 1 or 2, so wet or occasionally wet. And then we have grasses, and I'll just go over a few for the sake of time. Mullygrass that everybody loves. You see it planted a lot, which is great because it's one of our natives. It's an ornamental clumping grass. In the fall, it produces fluffy pink purple flower stalks and can be planted in groups for a great visual effect. And then Fakahatchee grass. Sometimes it's called Easter gamma grass. You might have heard it referred to as that, but it's a large, very large, about 4 to 6 feet clumping grass that's easy to grow and easy to propagate. Makes a great accent plant or border. It's drought tolerant and tolerant of standing and flooding water. There's a dwarf version that only gets about 2 to 3 feet if you don't have the space for it. It will brown and die back in periods of below freezing, but it returns in the spring. It can be pruned, but it really doesn't need it. It's also a larval host for the Bisus skipper in butterfly, Bisus skipper in butterfly. Okay. Trees, I'm only going to cover a couple because our rain gardens usually aren't long enough to or large enough to have trees. So some smaller shrubs that can be pruned into tree, or Virginia willow is a shrub that can be pruned into a tree form. It grows really well in wet areas. It has white blooms in the spring through summer. It's easy to propagate and attracts a variety of butterflies. There's shrimp plant, which turns into a small shrub. It's a non-native tropical perennial, but it's really easy to grow and it's easy to recognize because its flowers look like a shrimp. It's killed back in the frost, but it usually returns. If it is twiggy, you can prune it back time to time and it will form an attractive clump. And it's a favorite for hummingbirds and butterflies. And then the button bush, that'll be the last one I cover, I think. They're usually found in roadsides or wetlands. And it is a shrub. Without pruning, it will become a round bush, or you can prune it into a tree form. It has deciduous leaves. Flowers season is March through August, and it's ideal for the center of the rain garden because it prefers moderate to wet soil. It does benefit from pruning and it has a long lifespan. Every part of the plant is actually used by pollinators. Hummingbirds, butterflies, and bees are attracted to the flowers. Seeds offer food for birds, and leaves provide shelter. All right, so where to purchase? You can go to FloridaNativePlantSociety.org and type in the type of plants you're looking for, and it will show you a list of nurseries, same as FANN.org. Our Master Gardeners are having a sale coming up Mother's Day weekend in May 2023. You can treasure hunt at big box stores. I said this last time, but just make sure you know the cultivator that you're looking for. You can order online. My tip is if you're ordering especially seeds online, make sure that they're Florida ecotype and they're not from different parts that won't do, different parts of the country that might not do as well when they're here in Florida. All right, so I just want to thank everybody here and online. Thank you for your time and efforts to conserve water. And the Master Gardeners are happy to help you create your own garden in your landscape. So if you have any questions, you can email us, give us a call. Are they online? Is everything going well? Okay, or put it in the chat box and yeah. Okay, good. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. Oh, it's lovely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And then at the base of your gutter, you could also use stones so it traps the water a little bit longer. And I mean, check your soil, see if it's sandy already, so that way it doesn't flush the stones away. But if you use the stones and then cover it with mulch, hopefully it'll trap that and sink down. Okay. Right, anyone online? Any other questions? I have a bog garden, but not a rain garden. They're a little different. All right, well, thank you all very much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining online. And we'll make sure that everyone gets a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, as well as a link to the recording on our YouTube channel. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and you all take care, and we'll follow up with all those additional resources. Thank you.